Well, let's get more analysis now. We can speak to Mark Fitzpatrick, an Associate Fellow at the Institute for Strategic Studies, who joins us from Washington. Mr. Fitzpatrick, thank you very much indeed for joining us on Arabiya English. So we've got these indirect nuclear talks taking place in Geneva as we speak, more or less. Are there any clues, any signals that tell us how those talks are going?
Well, we don't know too much at all coming directly from the talks, but I thought one interesting signal came shortly before the talks when Iranian representatives were talking about that U.S. sanctions, if they were lifted, would allow for U.S. investors and businessmen, women, to do trade with Iran. And this is something that has not been part of previous deals with Iran about allowing U.S. businesses. And I think it's something that would appeal to President Trump, who has complained in the past about the United States losing out, that trade was allowed with Europeans and others, but not with Americans.
Okay. And President Trump all the while saying he's involved indirectly in those talks taking place at the residence of the Omani ambassador to Geneva. Obviously, if a deal is struck, it will be framed by the leadership in Iran as having been a great victory for them. And I'm just wondering whether that's a gift you can see President Trump wanting to give them.
Well, I think President Trump knows enough about making deals that both sides have to be able to claim victory. That's the classical win-win deal. So, on the one hand, he doesn't want to do something that would prop up the regime, a regime he has talked about wanting to overthrow, regime change to help the Iranian people. But on the other hand, if he can strike a deal, you have to strike a deal with your adversary and, hold your nose and get something that's best for the United States. And if he can get Iran to dial way back on its nuclear program, that would be a benefit.
Okay, the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, saying reaching a deal with Tehran will be, quote, extremely difficult, or very difficult, I think were his exact words. Do you think expectations are really as low as all that? Or is that, do you suspect, perhaps a bargaining tactic, a negotiating tactic?
Gosh, it's hard to know how to read this. Certainly people always talk that way before negotiations to try to lower the bar. And then there's the other possibility that all of this is just for show, and that the real objective is to prepare for a military attack, to set demands that are impossible for Iran to reach, and then when they don't reach them, to say, okay, we tried everything, and now let's go to the military option. But I think Trump really does hope that he can get a deal, without having to use his military. And I think there is still a possibility of that.
How weakened do you think the leadership in Iran is looking right now?
Oh, they're weakened on so many fronts. They don't have their proxy allies to be able to hit back at Israel. They don't have air defenses that can defend against any attacks on them. The people are rising up against them, not immediately now in the streets, but the people have showed that they detest this regime. On the other hand, the regime has got all of the levers of power. They have a monopoly on guns and violence. So the regime is not toppling. The economy is not, in terrible, terrible dire straits. It's got problems, but I wouldn't, we shouldn't think that this regime is about to fall.
I mean, are there any splits within the regime? And can you see a scenario in which perhaps the executive, i.e. the president of Iran, somehow or other tries to distance himself from the supreme leader and perhaps even paves the way for a scenario in which the supreme leader is removed from the equation? I mean, that's what obviously President Trump sounds like he would like as a scenario. Is it something that you think is remotely realistic?
It's not remotely realistic, at least judging from everything one can see coming out of Iran. There's not any visible cracks in the Iranian establishment. The military are solidly with the supreme leader. Trump's, I think he's got this fantasy of a Venezuela type situation where he takes out the top person and makes deals with the vice president. That doesn't look possible in Iran unless a U.S. military attack were to decapitate the supreme leader, then somebody else would come to the fore. But that's not what you're asking. You're asking, would they themselves try to replace the leader? And no, I don't see that happening.
I mean, Ali Khamenei not sounding particularly conciliatory today. There is, of course, the military exercise that's been taking place today in the Strait of Hormuz. And we've also heard from the Supreme Leader saying, with reference to the United States, the strongest army in the world can sometimes be slapped so hard it cannot get up, he said. I'm just wondering how you think that's going to sit with President Trump.
Oh, I think again, Trump is smart enough to know that the other side can huff and puff, but they can't blow his house down. It's interesting that back in June, Iran did not respond very forcefully at all to the U.S. military attacks. They responded to Israel. They sent over 500 missiles against Israel, killed dozens of Israelis and hundreds more wounded. But against the United States, they just sent a few missiles against U.S. airbase in Qatar and they flagged it, so there were no casualties at all. So Iran has to try to restore deterrence in political science lingo, because they didn't last time, and they gave the impression that they're a pushover. They have to try to correct that, and that's why Khamenei is talking so tough right now.
Right, he's talking about sinking battleships in the waters that are in the region. There's another U.S. Air Force, a U.S. aircraft carrier on the way there, the USS Gerald R. Ford. I mean, what do you think is the effect of Ali Khamenei saying these things? We can sink a U.S. warship. Why is he saying that?
Well, he's trying to tell the United States that this time Iran is not going to turn the other cheek. If they're attacked, they're going to respond forcefully. And he's telling that to his people, of course. That's the primary audience, to tell the Iranian people that Iran will respond forcefully, to show that that the leadership will defend the country, which they didn't do last June. I think that was in the background too. It's not the main reason why people were rising up, but that was there. So the Supreme Leader and the rest of the leadership, they have a very difficult job. They've got to assure the people that they're going to stand up. They've got to actually do something if they're attacked, and they're not going to be able to sink a U.S. battleship. The U.S. Navy is very powerful. They've got warning systems, and I think Iran's military is no match for them.
Okay, I mean, as I was saying, the aircraft carrier, the USS Gerald R. Ford, is on the way. That's the world's largest warship, I'm told. But it won't be there for another couple of weeks. And I'm just wondering whether that gives us any clues as to what the timing of any eventual US military action could be.
Yeah, Tom, I think you put your finger on it then by giving that time frame for how long it'll take the U.S. Gerald Ford to get in place. The last time in June, the United States had 2 aircraft carriers in the region, and they were able to use both of them to hit Iran very hard, but not very long. And this time, probably if the United States attacks, it's going to have to be more than just attacking some nuclear facilities, which after all have already been destroyed. So I think that there will need to be more assets in place, and this is, probably why negotiations can be expected to continue for a while longer, because the United States is not yet ready for not a full-scale invasion, but a full-scale airstrike.
I mean, because of what happened last time, and I'm talking about in June when talks were ongoing, and yet the US struck. Do you see a scenario in which there could be either another surprise attack by the United States, or perhaps flipping the coin, the Iranians taking preemptive action in the event that they suspect such a course of action might be in the offing?
I think it's far more likely that Israel and the United States would attack in a surprise way, the way they did back in June while diplomacy was ongoing. Israel is, the United States doesn't have all of its forces in place yet, but Israel does. Israel is ready to attack. And that may well be the case that when Netanyahu came to town last week, that they struck a deal. The United States gave Israel a green light to attack. Trump said, let me at least have another round or two of diplomacy. But if it doesn't look like it's going to work, we know you have to do what you have to do, something like that. I think that's very possible. And then the United States could join in, even with only one aircraft carrier in place. Israel would do most of the damage. As for Iran taking a preemptive action, I see no point of that. It would lose the moral high ground. It wouldn't be able to really do that much more damage than it would do if it struck after being attacked. I mean, it would have more missiles available, because if it were attacked, Israel's going to take out some of those missiles. But Iran does not want a big war. They would very much want to try to get some diplomatic deal and continue to place the emphasis on that.
Okay, I mean, this is already the second round of talks in this latest set of discussions. I mean, how many rounds do you think it will take before President Trump loses patience?
Normally diplomatic talks can go on for a long time, months, years. Back in when the 2015 Iran nuclear deal that Obama struck, that took 2 years to get there. And those were talks where the United States and Iran were talking directly. Now they're not even talking directly. They're talking, one of them goes and talks to the Omanis and then goes home, back to their hotel, and then the other side goes and the Omanis say, well, this is what the other side said. And, it's very cumbersome. It's not a very, because, if there are questions and so forth, they don't get answered right away. So it should take longer if you have these kind of so-called proximity talks. But the question is, how much patience does President Trump have for all this? And his patience is limited. So I would think that if they go on for 6 rounds or so and don't show any sign of resulting in a deal, that might be it might exhaust his patience.
Okay, well, we'll be keeping a very close eye on those talks and any updates and press releases or press statements that are given thereafter. In the meantime, thank you very much indeed, Mark Fitzpatrick, Associate Fellow at the Institute for Strategic Studies. Thank you very much indeed for your time, sir.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Well, let's get more now. We can speak to General Dana Pittard, who's a retired U.S. Army general. Thank you very much indeed for joining us, sir. I'd just like to start by asking you, the United States has sent considerable military naval material to the region. There's the USS Abraham Lincoln off the coast of Iran right now, together with destroyers, combat ships, fighter jets across the region. How likely do you think it is that this is going to become a military confrontation?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. And the U.S. has sent quite a bit of capability to the area. Not only the USS aircraft carrier Abraham Lincoln, but also another carrier battle group is certainly en route. Hopefully, there will be no military conflict, but I think that depends on what happens in the talks with Iran in Geneva. And right now, there are certainly issues. Iran has their demands, what they like to see done, and the U.S. and backed up with Israel also have their demands.
Okay, and I mean, just in terms of reading between the lines, and as you mentioned there, the USS Gerald R. Ford, which is the world's largest aircraft carrier, is on the way, but it'll take another couple of weeks to arrive, perhaps 3 weeks. Does that tell us anything about the timing of any possible military operation by the U.S.?
Well, if you remember, it was a little while ago where President Trump had made threats against Iran for what the Iranians were doing to their own people as far as killing protesters. And he said that if they didn't stop, he would do something. Well, I think his advisors took him aside and said, look, Mr. President, we don't have the capabilities there in theater at this point. So that's why the U.S. is rushing to get more capability. Now, what we're seeing are certainly the aircraft carrier battle groups going there, but there's other things that are also coming to the region, whether it's air defense capability, more land-based missile systems, and other capabilities coming to the area overall. But the timing of it is hopefully things will work out in Geneva. Obviously, the U.S. delegation led by Steve Witkoff, and then President Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, on one side, and then the foreign minister of Iran on the other side. Each has their own requirements and demands. The U.S. wants an end to Iran's nuclear capability, and Israel would like to see some of their ballistic missiles reduced also. And of course, Iran would like to see an easing of the sanctions. Those are, I think, the kind of red lines for both sides.
Right, and those talks are taking place in the context of profound, I think it's fair to say, mistrust on both sides, given the history. And you know, it's not just the US that are making it clear that the military option is there. The Revolutionary Guard is carrying out drills in the Strait of Hormuz. Part of the Strait of Hormuz was closed today for safety reasons. What's Iran trying to tell the United States, do you think?
Well, I think Iran is trying to tell the United States that they're not going to be a pushover. That yes, you're bringing the world's largest aircraft carrier, but even that can be destroyed by, an anti-ship missile if you're not careful, U.S. That would be a grave error on the part of Iran if they were to do that. And I think the U.S. is also sending a message that even in the attacks last year against the Iranian nuclear sites, President Trump chose not to go after the supreme leader. All gloves will be off if there is a conflict this time. And so I think Iran knows that, and certainly the U.S. knows that.
And of course, we were talking earlier about U.S. military assets in the region. Just looking at the position of the USS Abraham Lincoln, it's about 500 miles or 700 kilometers or so off the coast of Oman. And I'm just wondering, what indications should we look for when it comes to trying to determine whether a military action could be imminent? What would be a clue that that is the road that the US has decided to go down?
I think when both carrier battle groups are in position, that could certainly be a trigger. But those are just the more obvious ones. If you remember, when the U.S. attacked the nuclear sites, all the attention of the world was based on these aircraft coming out of from maybe the east, when in fact they came out from the west. It was a decoy. So there's more going on in the region, just the aircraft carriers.
Right. I mean, just in the event that Iran did come under attack from the United States, can you see, I mean, you know the region well, can you envisage any country or any militant group somehow coming to their rescue, coming to help them?
For Iran?
Yeah.
Well, again, so many of Iran's allies have been, in some ways, been neutralized to an extent. Hezbollah is nothing where it was before as far as capability. Hamas has been reduced significantly. The Houthis might, start firing a couple of missiles. That might be about it. And then the Shia militias in Iran may act up. But even in Syria, with the change in government in Syria, Iran cannot count on Syria. So Iran is in a more vulnerable position than they've been in quite a while, as far as allies.
Right, as far as allies are concerned in the region, but also domestically, it's suggested that levels of support for the leadership in Iran are extremely low. And therefore, I'm wondering, does that, in your view, make the leadership in Iran look extremely vulnerable?
Sure. But the U.S. has got to be careful, because the idea of an organized resistance in Iran, it's not as organized as I think the U.S. would like it to be. So if you remove the regime in Iran in some way, who takes its place? It's not like it was back in the Iranian Revolution back in, 1978, 79, where you had this movement. So it's not quite like that. But domestically, the Iranian government is vulnerable based on killing its own people in the protests. And it's been reported that thousands of people were killed.
Right, and looking at how vulnerable they are, I mean, do you think there could be a sense of they've got nothing to lose? And I'm wondering whether, given the history between the United States and Iran and the attack in June, which was a surprise attack by the United States, do you see perhaps Iran doing something preemptive in the event that it looks like a deal really isn't going to be struck?
I think if Iran does that, that would be very dangerous. And at this point, I think in addition to trying to have the sanctions eased, the most important thing to Iran right now is regime preservation. So if they were to do a preemptive strike against the United States or U.S. assets in the region, that would make their regime vulnerable because the U.S. would go all out against Iran. And Iran doesn't want that.
I mean, if regime preservation is the goal, as you say, I mean, by handing a deal to the Iranians to sign, which would inevitably mean that some of the sanctions are eased, the economy would improve, I mean, it might actually boost the popularity of the leadership in Iran. Do you think that's a gift the United States is willing to give Iran at this particular stage?
Well, that could happen, but if it means that Iran ends its nuclear ambitions and nuclear capabilities, then it might be worth it to the Trump administration.
Let's just look at what the United States has been doing already this year. Obviously, Venezuela was the start of the year, very early in 2026. Do you think there are any parallels between the preparations for that and the flotilla that was sent to the Caribbean and what we're seeing happening in the Gulf?
Well, the U.S. has had immense capability in the Middle East and specifically the Gulf region for decades. And so there's already capability there, but there's more capability when you bring in two carrier battle groups. For Venezuela, it was a little bit different because it was closer to the U.S., so even more U.S. forces could be flown in and used against Venezuela as a part of the operation to get President Maduro and his wife. Would you have something like that here? Maybe, but there's more capability. So I think the U.S. is taking the situation in Iran even more seriously than Venezuela. Venezuela was a very complex operation to actually capture the president of the country. But for Iran, which has much more military capability than Venezuela has, it's much more dangerous, and it will require much more U.S. Capability and forces in the region.
Do you think there are other options at the Americans' disposal that are perhaps slightly more covert than carrying out airstrikes, any kind of? I mean, I think we can probably safely say that any land operations are highly unlikely. But what about covert operations? What about commandos? What could the U.S. do?
I think it's full spectrum. I mean, I think it's everything from air defense to cyber, sea-based. There's covert operations, obviously, because I think between Israel and the U.S., they have a good idea where every major Iranian leader is. And the Iranians know that. So it's a lot of capability, what we call full spectrum capability.
Okay, and were things to escalate, I mean, clearly the Gulf powers, the GCC nations, have expressed their concern, and they've expressed concern that things could escalate into a regional conflict. Do you share that assessment, and how far and wide do you think the consequences of any conflict could be?
I mean, it could escalate into a regional conflict, but remember, that was also predicted last summer. Oh, if the U.S. attacks the nuclear facilities of Iran, that'll be all-out war. Well, it wasn't, because of how the U.S., and with the help of Israel, did that, as far as neutralizing communications, even some level of leadership, but not the supreme leader in Iran. And I think ultimately what the Trump administration would like to see is a version of the Abraham Accords between Iran and Iran and Saudi Arabia and Israel. That would have been unthinkable a while ago, but it's something that at least is being thought of at this point.
Right, and all the while, the supreme leader in Iran is sounding pretty hostile. He said today that even the strongest army in the world, i.e. the United States, he seemed to be saying, can sometimes be, quote, slapped so hard it cannot get up again. How do you think that's going to go down with President Trump? It's
not going to go down. In fact, he takes those things personally. But people realize that the Ayatollah Khamenei is old, and he's out of touch in many ways. That's pretty obvious by the protests that took place, the violent protests that took place, the violent reaction by the Iranian regime against him. He's out of touch. So I don't think anybody is putting much into his comments.
Okay. I mean, how many rounds of talks do you think it's going to be before President Trump loses patience, sir?
I think there'll be a couple rounds. He'll lose patience once he has the capability in the region. So there's only probably a couple more weeks.
You're saying that within a couple of weeks, the U.S. could quite seriously be ready and able to go down the military route?
Right. I wouldn't be surprised in a couple more weeks. But then again, the U.S. didn't have to necessarily have the second carrier battle group there. That also could be a ploy, so that the world is thinking, oh, we have a couple more weeks, when in fact they have capabilities now to do certain things. Okay. So we'll see.
Well, it's very interesting. We really appreciate you taking the time to speak to us and sharing your expertise with us. General Dana Pittard, retired U.S. Army General. Thank you for your time, sir.
Great. Thank you for having me.